The World Development Goal to reduce by half the prevalence of poverty between 1990 and 2015 has been achieved. It was achieved ahead of time. We still have until the end of this year to achieve those goals. The goal to reduce by half the prevalence of hunger has almost been achieved. We are very, very close to achieving it. We will not achieve it by the end of the year, but it's very close. And as you know, these Millennium Development Goals end at the end of 2015. The bad news is that more than 10% of the global population still do not have enough to eat. And between 20 and 25% of the global population suffer from nutrient deficiency of some nutrient. Could be a mineral, could be iron, could be a vitamin. Now let me suggest the challenge. The new Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed upon by the members of the United Nations 2 weeks ago in New York, and they will take effect at the end of this year, calls for, and I quote, ending all forms of malnutrition by 2030, end of quote. Can we do this? I don't know, but we ought to make every effort to try. And this is where fish and seafood come in. As Maggie already mentioned, fish and seafood occupy an extremely important part of our daily diet. And these commodities or these foods can do a lot more. One of the things we need to do as a community is to integrate into the debate about food security and nutrition fish and seafood, fisheries, and aquaculture. These things need to be integrated, and I really applaud the Ambassador Quinn and his team for organizing or for suggesting this session, because that is a step in the right direction. Also, having fish integrated with a wonderful soybean-based lunch is another step in the right direction. That part we haven't had much trouble with. But when it comes to talking about how do we solve the food security and nutrition problems, we frequently talk about fish and aquaculture and fisheries over here, and then we talk about everything that is not swimming over there. We need to bring these things together, and in this symposium, we are, of course, making a step in the right direction. We're in for a real treat during the next hour. We got 3 world-renowned experts in the areas, in the sectors of fishery, agriculture, and nutrition, and related matters. We only have an hour, so we're only going to talk about some of the most important issues, and we're going to focus on what needs to be done in order to achieve the Millennium Development Goal that I just mentioned. So we can't get into a lot of details, and that's why the World Food Prize agreed to include in your package this report from the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, which gives you a lot more detail. I should mention that the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition was created by the committee, the United Nations Committee on Food Security, to develop evidence which the committee can use for making recommendations and decisions. This particular report was initiated under the chairmanship of Dr. Swaminathan, and I was fortunate to take over after MS Swaminathan to finish the report. Let me now introduce the 3 panel members. Let me begin with Arne Mathiesen. He's an Assistant Director General of the Fisheries and Agriculture Department at the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO. He holds degrees in veterinary medicine and aquatic veterinary science. After completing his studies, he worked as a veterinarian, specializing in fish diseases for 10 years, and was also the managing director of an aquaculture firm combining theory and practice. In 1991, Mr. Mathiasen was elected to the Icelandic Parliament. He served as Minister for Fisheries and subsequently as Minister for Finance. He has been in the decision-making position, in the advising position, in the practical agriculture position. He's eminently qualified to talk about how these things all fit together. He joined FAO in 2010. Jeppe Kolding, specializing in small-scale fisheries in developing countries and the ecology and exploitation of fish, is currently a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Bergen in Norway. He's done his research on fish stock assessment, ecology, harvest strategies, and management of small-scale tropical fisheries. He's been a member of the Fisheries Expert Group of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature since 2008, where he, among many other things, initiated the work on balanced harvest. He told me just a few hours ago that in addition to his expertise embodied in what I just mentioned, he's also a nurse and a midwife. And he has actually practiced both of those occupations in Africa. And he tells me that that's kind of the beginning of his interest in the nutrition and subsequently in fish as it relates to the well-being of people. Last but by no means least on our panel, we have Shakuntala Tilsted. She is a senior nutrition scientist at World Fish, which, as you know, is one of the CGIAR centers. Her area of research and expertise is within food-based strategies for improved food and nutrition security in low-income countries. She focuses on the potential of micronutrient-rich small fish and fish products in supplying essential nutrients for improving nutrition and health, especially in women and young children. Shakuntala and I were on the faculty together at the University of Copenhagen for a period of time, and I know her expertise is really outstanding, not only in nutrition as such, but also as it relates to fish. Now, what we would like to do during the next 55 minutes or whatever time is left is to first have a round of up to 5 minutes each, basically talking about what really is the role of fish and seafood, or if you want to look at it from the production side on fisheries and agriculture, in achieving food security and nutrition for all, and any other aspects that relate to that. So I'm going to ask each panel member to speak for up to 5 minutes on that to kind of set the stage for the discussion. Then I'll come back with some questions depending on what they tell us, and then hopefully we'll have some time to go to the audience for some additional questions. So with that, Arnie, would you like to begin? No, just stay where you are.
Yes, thank you, Per. If I may start by echoing your appreciation of the organizers for setting up this panel and inviting us to be here. It's much appreciated. The importance of fisheries and aquaculture, as you mentioned, lies primarily in nutrition, but also in the livelihoods provide, and in the cultural effects and influences that fish has. I'm not going to go deeply into nutrition because I expect that Shakuntala will do that a little bit more detail. But I can't refrain from mentioning it a little bit from the point of view of the omega-3 fatty acid that fish provides us with almost exclusively. My friend, the medical professor Michael Crawford of Imperial College, he maintains that our species, Homo sapiens, didn't start to think rationally until we moved down to the waterfront and started eating fish. And that basically our brains are made of omega-3 fatty acids. And he further maintains that the future of mankind is therefore based on fish. Well, the livelihood aspect is not to be neglected. because there are calculations to the effect that 12% of humankind base their livelihoods on fisheries and the fisheries economy. And if we look at the cultural aspect, we only need to look to Asia, particularly East Asia, to see the growth in the middle classes and the subsequent effects on fish consumption, where fish is held in very high regard. So, therefore, the status of fisheries and aquaculture is of high importance to us. The status of the stocks, the status of the catch, and the status of the production. We have, for 20 years, experienced a leveling out, or some would say stagnation in the growth of wild catches. They have been now for 20 years around 90 million tons per annum. The 20 years before that saw a very rapid increase in catches, which were obviously unsustainable. What followed on this rapid increase in catches was an increase in the number of stocks that were fished beyond biologically sustainable levels. However, for the past 20 years, the number of stocks that are beyond biological sustainable levels has been roughly the same, so just under 30% of the stocks. That is not a good situation for us. We should be able to improve that. But relatively speaking, I think most of my friends in the biodiversity sector would be happy with having the same situation today as they had 20 years ago. Aquaculture has, however, been the fastest growing food sector in this 20-year period. And the growth in aquaculture has been such that the supply of fish has probably never been greater, touching now 20 kilos per capita per annum, and a production of 70 million tons annually. What then lies in the future, and what can we expect of fisheries and aquaculture, and what do fisheries and aquaculture have to provide us with? We have done a range of calculations with a number of partners, and we have come to the conclusion that the production needs to increase somewhere between 50 and 100 million tons per annum by the year 2030. If we are to avoid that the regions that are most susceptible to lowered fish supply, that are consuming least today, are going to see an even lowered consumption. And that is to say, sub-Saharan Africa. How do we then supply these extra 50 to 100 million tons? If we are very, very good at managing our fisheries, we could expect maybe 10 to 15 million tons additionally from capture fisheries. We could expect to get 15, 20 million tons from reduction in waste, and possibly another 10 to 15 from transferring from non-food consumption to human consumption. But the bulk of the increase would have to come from aquaculture. So there is a lot that we are asking this relatively new sector to do, and we need to all come together in making sure that we develop aquaculture to meet these goals in a sustainable way.
Thank you very much, Arne. Jeppe?
Thank you very much, and thank you here for inviting me and Professor Quinn. It is true. I started my young life in Africa as a nurse and a midwife. I was a volunteer at that time, and I was posted in northern Kenya, next to a lake called Turkana, which is the fourth biggest lake in Africa. It was one of the worst droughts in recorded history at that time, and I was posted there in a hospital. There was no doctors. I was alone with another Danish nurse. I'm a small Dane, by the way. Pierre's a great Dane. I'm a small Dane. And people were dying of hunger. We heard yesterday about people who had witnessed people dying of hunger. I've seen it also. And there we were next to this great lake, the fourth biggest in Africa, and it was relatively full of fish. And it just crossed my mind, how can people die of hunger next to a lake with fish in it? So later, for various purposes, I changed my path, and I ended up as a biologist, a fisheries biologist. But I've kept working in Africa. I spent all my professional life in small-scale fisheries, primarily in Africa and in Southeast Asia. And it's always been sort of a puzzle to me why fish is going under the radar. Why is it not recognized as more important? And particularly when we think about the productivity that is available to us. 70% of our planet is covered with water, and yet the fisheries only contribute about 2, maybe 3% of the human food consumption in the world. The primary productivity, the basis of all what we eat, I mean, what is created by the sun and photosynthesis, is about equal on land and water. The oceans and the terrestrial environment they each produce about 50 billion metric tons of carbon per year. And we eat directly from that on the terrestrial phase 2.5 billion metric tons. We are 80% herbivores. We are vegetarians, basically. But if the oceans are so productive, how come that by only 100 million tons, we are claiming they are overfished? We are depleting the fish stocks. There must be a huge potential out there that we are not utilizing. That's always been a puzzle to me, and I've been starting working on that. I've been sort of trying to understand it. And then I understood that these two ecosystems are quite different, and the way we're utilizing the land and the way we're utilizing our waters are completely different. We have this trophic pyramid most people know about. I mean, we have the primary producers, the photosynthesis, and then we have the herbivores, and then we have the carnivores. And most of our food is, or as I already said, it is vegetarian, and then we have our domesticated animals that is providing a certain amount of protein. But the difference between the land and the water, and which many people forget, is that we don't have any big plants in the water. The limitations of photosynthesis in the water is light, and if you are not close to the shore somewhere, you have to be floating, and in order to survive as a floating organism in the water, you have to be very, very small. Can you imagine if all our grasses and trees, we needed a microscope to study it, or to see them even? There would be, I mean, there's no great herbivores in the water. There's no elephants and ox and cows and things like that. So the food chain in the water, after a few millimeters of size, or even 1 millimeter of size, it becomes carnivorous. From then on, everything that is eating everything, they eat meat. And when we get to the level where we start fishing the fish, like salmon or tuna or everything like, we are at the trophic level of 4 to 5. We are fishing at levels that we don't even see on land. We are fishing on the mythical animals on land that would be eating lions. Because the cows in the water are zooplankton, they're a few millimeters big. So when we are harvesting cod, as we do in Norway, we are harvesting at trophic level that we don't find on land. So we have a huge potential, but we have to go down in the food chain in the water. We have to change the other way. We have an inverted pyramid in the water, in our fisheries. So we talk about overfishing. Yes, we are overfishing some stocks, as Arne mentioned, but that is the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the iceberg, the 90% of the iceberg, we are not touching it. And we have the potential of utilizing that. We can utilize that for either consumption directly or for the increased aquaculture that we need. So I wanted to start my talk about that because I think it's very fundamental that we understand this big difference between land productivity and water productivity.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeppe. Shakuntala.
Thank you, Pierre, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel. I'll begin with telling 4 different short stories about why I work with fish and why I work with fish and food and nutrition security. I am from Trinidad and Tobago, and I remember as a child, one of my uncles won the Island Scholarship, and my grandmother was interviewed by the national newspaper. I don't remember all what she said, but I remembered clearly her saying, well, my child is intelligent because I fed him fish when he was a small boy. And that stuck with me. Then many, many years later, I worked at the very renowned research institute in Bangladesh called the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research. And I was working with nutrition rehabilitation. That's at the stages when children come in when they can't even move and they have to be rehabilitated, suffering from undernutrition. And it was very frustrating because about 7,000 children came into this center every year. 2/3 were boys, 1/3 girls. And usually they were so sick and so undernourished that they were brought in at too late a stage, and many of them died. And I was extremely frustrating working at this end, and I wanted to work much further up where I could do something for them. And my background is in agriculture from the University of the West Indies. There aren't many women in agriculture in the West Indies, and there aren't many women, even today, working with fisheries. And one of the scientists at the ICDDRB, who had in fact patented the salt sugar solution for diarrhea, said to me, if you really want to do something for these children, you should work with making sure they eat fish. And that would help with their undernutrition. So I went back to work in Copenhagen at the University of the Copenhagen, and I decided to work with fish and food and nutrition security. Many years after, now I still work in Bangladesh, and some of the issues are the same. I work in an area in northwest Bangladesh where the poverty levels are very high and the undernutrition rates are very high. And when you talk to women in this area, they are extremely poor. They tell you that we do not have enough food to feed our children, that we do not have enough time to prepare foods for our children. And with this focus on the first 1,000 days of life, I decided to work with women and the nutrition of these women. So we, together with colleagues from Bangladesh, we developed a fish chutney. A fish chutney is the same process as you make with a mango chutney in Bangladesh to suit the culture, to suit the food traditions. There's, of course, a lot of chili in the fish chutney. 1 tablespoon of the fish chutney is equivalent to 60 grams of raw fish. And we have introduced this and done focus group discussions with these women who tell us they are less tired, they produce more milk. We feed it to pregnant and lactating women. They produce more milk. They can see that their children are healthier, they grow stronger, they cry less. And in the villages where we work, these children are called Shukti children, Shukti meaning well-nourished children. We have done no interventions with the children, but with the mothers, with the pregnant women and the lactated women, up to 6 months after birth. Even with all these reports we have from the mothers. As a scientist, if I need to talk about the results of this, I must be able to publish it in international journals. In order to publish it, I must do an efficacy study. I must show that women who have got this fish chutney, compare them to women who have not got the fish chutney, and do studies, see what differences there are in milk production, in milk composition, in their body weight mass. To do these studies require quite a lot of money. A really rigorous efficacy study can cost up to $1 million to do all the tests. And sometimes I wonder in exasperation, why do I have to do this when I can remember quite clearly what my grandmother said when I was small? I fed fish, and this is why my child is intelligent.
Okay, thank you very much, Shakuntala. Let me follow up with you on the first question. When I read the popular press, I hear that we shouldn't be eating fish from aquaculture, yet Arne is telling us that the future demand for fish would have to be met primarily through aquaculture. If I eat fish from aquaculture, I'm consuming a lot of pesticides, a lot of antibiotics, and the fish are polluting the water in aquaculture, they're polluting the river. This is really a terrible situation. Tell us why that is all wrong.
Aquaculture is much more complex and much more diverse than producing, for example, in salmon in Norway. If you look again from Bangladesh, Bangladesh is now the 4th largest aquaculture producing country in the world. Of course, China is #1 and much higher than all the rest. But the aquaculture in Bangladesh, the majority of aquaculture in Bangladesh is small scale. And there are many different approaches that one can use. When Denmark, many years ago, 25 years ago, began supporting the growth of aquaculture in Bangladesh, it was all about pond polyculture of carp. And the one way that you did this was that you went in and poisoned the ponds and removed all the indigenous small fish. Then you stocked with carp, and you grew the carp to large size, 4 or 5 months, and this was what people sold, and this was what they ate. When you start from a different point of view, if you start, for example, with the consumption of fish in Bangladesh, you would see that the majority of fish that's consumed is small fish. And when I started working in Bangladesh, then since it was a Danish project, I could very easily go in and try to influence the project. So we took out 10 ponds and we said, what if you don't poison these ponds, but you let the carp grow together with the small fish? What did we see? We saw that we got an increased production of fish, total production of fish, and the nutritional quality of the total production improved, because the small fish has a much higher nutritional value than large fish, mainly because they are eaten whole, but also because they feed differently, as Jeppe was saying, and they have higher micronutrient contents. And if you look, and if you see now, if you go into consumption studies in Bangladesh, and you remove the fish, the small fish that the poor eat, you are removing more than 30% of the calcium and about 50% of the vitamin A. So a diversity of systems in aquaculture is very important in order to meet the nutritional needs.
So, Arne, can we change the demand structure? So instead of demanding salmon, we're going to demand smaller fish? Or are we stuck with the current demand structure for future generations? How do we solve this problem? If I want salmons, And Shakuntala is telling me I would be much better off with smaller fish. How do we change that consumer behavior? Or is it something else we need to change?
Of course we can change it. If you look 20, 30 years into the past, we weren't eating salmon. There was hardly any salmon to be available unless just during the height of summer when the angling season was. So we can definitely change this. And in fact, the salmon industry has itself changed quite a lot and is totally different today from what it was before. I, however, agree with sort of the sentiment of your question, that we have to change our aquaculture if aquaculture is going to sort of meet the goals that I was mentioning, and that is basically because of environmental restrictions that we will meet. And we will more and more have to go into low input aquaculture with fish that are lower in the trophic pyramid or at the lower trophic levels, and to a larger extent into non-fed aquaculture, where at the same time as we are producing food, we are in fact cleaning up the environment. And this we can do both in monocultures and in polycultures. So there are a lot of opportunities to change. How we, however, do that, that is a much bigger and a more difficult question. And if we were really sort of serious in changing our consumption habits in that way, we would probably start with some other species and with fish and aquaculture species and start to try and change our consumption patterns. But I don't think that is necessarily necessary or realistic to do. So I think we should concentrate on the sort of the leading edge, where we are developing sort of the future products, and in that way, gradually we would re-educate future consumers and possibly affect change. Even in the US, the consumption patterns have changed over the past 20, 30 years. And there's not so much consumption of beef and far higher consumption of chicken. And of course, a far higher consumption both of salmon and shrimp.
Okay. Well, I have a suggestion. Up until 3 years ago, I liked salmon a lot, and I never ate sardines. Then I got involved in this study, and now I eat sardines and very few salmon. So if we could get everybody to read this report, we might be on our way. Jeppe, you mentioned to me just before this session that aquaculture hasn't really caught on as much as you would like in sub-Saharan Africa, but fish catching is a much more important source. What can governments do, the African governments, what can they do to promote sustainable, ecology-friendly aquaculture in sub-Saharan Africa so that people can meet more of their nutrient needs and generate income for small farmers, by the way?
I don't think Africa is ready for aquaculture yet. And Shakuntala said just before, it will not be ready for the next 20 years, and I tend to agree with her. And for some very simple reasons. First of all, the wild capture fisheries in inland Africa are not overfished, far from. The recorded amount is about 2.5 million tons, but we can probably multiply that with an order of magnitude to get to the actually takeout, and we can probably even increase that by another order of magnitude, almost, from the capture fisheries that is there. Fish, particularly tropical fish, are incredibly productive if they have the right conditions. If there is water, if there is rain, and then they will multiply. I mean, another difference between fish and terrestrial animals is that they have millions of eggs. They are so reproductive that if the conditions are right, they will explode. I had a situation, I was working in Botswana, one of the lakes there, was virtually dry. It was a dry pond for 20 years. It was a dust bowl. And then they had a good flood, and the lake filled up about 5 months after the pelicans moved in, and 1 month after the pelicans, the fishers moved in, and they're now taking out bumper yields. I mean, it is so productive. Aquaculture in Africa and aquaculture in the world in general, I mean, fish are carnivores, as I said. Even the tilapia, low trophic level fish in Africa, they need about 50% of the diet has to be protein and fat. And which small-scale farmer in Africa can afford to give his fish more nutritious food than he can give to his own children? And he can take his net and he can go out to the nearest river or lake or small water body, and he can catch 6, 5, 8 kilos of fish in a day, which a Malawian aquaculture farmer, he makes 12 kilo in a year after heavily subsidies from the international community. The economy is not there, the food is not there, and the wild capture fisheries are still so plentiful that there's less risk catching fish than growing them, and will be for a long time yet to come. So we have these ideas, we are over-depleting, we are fishing it down and things like that. It is true in some of the cases, but it's not true in inland fisheries in Africa yet, and that's why it will not work.
Okay, well, let's follow up on that then, Arnie. What kind of international action is needed to make marine fisheries sustainable again? You talked about overexploitation, and we're all familiar with all of the unsustainable activities in marine fisheries. What is it going to take from the international community? I presume we are talking about international action, because water doesn't stop at the country border. And I'm not sure how freely you can speak, since you do come from an international organization, but, and I can't tell you it's off the record, because that would be a lie. But come as close as you can before you get in trouble.
Well, as a...
You can call one of your friends and they can answer it for you.
No.
No, okay.
I don't think there's any risk in this. 70% of our fisheries are utilized within biologically sustainable limits, and this situation has been stabilizing over the last 20 years. So I would expect that that within the timeline that we have set ourselves in the SDGs, we could reach the goal by using the same methods that we have been developing over the past 20 years. The action has primarily to take place at the country level and inside the exclusive economic zones, because most of the fish catches of the world are inside the economic zones. Most of the productive areas of the oceans are close to shore in the shallower area. The deeper you go out, the less productive the fisheries are. So this has to happen at the national level, and I think we can manage it within the timeline with the methods that we're already using.
You would not be in favor of putting a chip on every ship that does any kind of fishing and keep track of where they are at all times, and if they're in the wrong area, they'll be fined, and would you like to pursue that kind of approach, kind of tough love at the international level?
I did that in Iceland. I had a computer screen on my desk in my office in the ministry in Iceland, and I could pull up every Icelandic ship and see where it was fishing and what it was doing. I could see from the... So this is what is happening all over the world. This is what all the countries are trying to do. They have variable resources to do it. So those that have little resources, they would do it if they could be supported in doing it.
So you're not worried about free riders?
There is, of course, always that possibility. It doesn't matter in which sector you're working. There are always people that break the law and are free riders. But I don't think you need to have any more severe policing in fisheries than you need to have in society in general. So I don't think we should sort of criminalize those that are involved in this industry beyond what is sort of general in our societies.
Jeppe, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. I'd like to continue the line that Shakuntala talked about, the small fish and the women. When I was doing my master's in Africa and I was out with my professor, there was some women and some children fishing along the shore with very small mesh-sized nets, cast nets, and we looked at their catches and it was tiny small fish, and my professor said, look, they are overfishing, they're catching the babies. This is destructive, this will destroy them. We have to stop, they have to use large mesh sizes, they have to let the babies grow up to become large. And I swallowed that, but then later I figured out he was wrong. Because these small fish, yes, some of them were babies, some were just small species, but they were actually much more numerous than the large ones, because to make one large salmon, you have to give it 5 kilos of small fish, or one large cod eats 5 or 6 kilos small fish. So yes, we can take one large fish, but then we can take 5 or 4 kilos of the small ones also. And these are much more nutritious. They're much more environmentally friendly because you sun dry them, as you said, you eat them whole. They're like instant noodles. They don't take much energy to cook. You don't have to cut down forests to smoke them like we do with the large fish. They are perfect vitamin bombs, but we are not allowed to catch them because we are catching the babies. They have mesh size regulations in every country in Africa, and that is a disaster.
Okay. Arne, you agree with that? We should just catch the babies? Hold on, Shakuntala is shaking her head. And Shakuntala, as you know, malaria nets are being used for catching fish, and they're catching the babies. Is that okay?
Well, first of all, there is a diversity of fish species. Again, going back to Bangladesh, where I've done a lot of my work, just the freshwater species, there are over close to 400 species. The majority of them are small, meaning less than 20 centimeters, even as adults. So there's a great diversity, which means that you can develop different production technologies that are appropriate. When we look at the consumption patterns in Africa and in many Asian countries, the large majority of fish that's consumed, especially by the poor, is dried fish. And in some Asian countries, it would be dry fish that's then made into fish paste or fish sauce as well. But it starts with dried small fish. And so if you want to meet the needs of the poor, it has to be, there is a distinction between what the poor eat, what they can afford, also because when you can buy very small quantities of dried fish. A dried fish is, as Jeppe was saying, it's a vitamin and mineral bomb because you have removed the water, so the nutrient contents are extremely high and concentrated. And if you can have production technologies which both produce large fish for income, for sale to urban markets or for export, and at the same time have systems that produce small fish for local consumption, especially of the poor, then of course you have a much more sustainable system and a much more a system that meets the needs of many.
Is the term sustainable intensification used in the fisheries sector like it is used in crop production? And is it a relevant concept as we developed aquaculture that is sustainable and takes care of the food safety. Is that an interesting concept in the fisheries sector, or do we just leave that for the cropping people? Does anybody want to address that? Go ahead.
Yes, that's definitely a concept that is being used in aquaculture. And within the so-called Blue Growth Initiative, which is sort of the overarching initiative that we are running in FAO, we have a regional Blue Growth Initiative in Asia, which is particularly focusing on sustainable intensification, on using the same amount of input, same amount of water, same amount of feed, same amount of land to produce more.
Is this a concept you ever used or would use?
I have used it indirectly because I think we can, as I tried to explain already, I'm a firm believer that we can increase productivity in the fisheries a lot. We can increase by changing our fishing patterns. I think we are fishing wrong. Imagine, there's a lot of farmers in this room, or most people here have experience with farming. Imagine that your cow or your sheep or your pig got 100,000 small babies. And not only they got 100,000 small babies, but these babies were eating each other, and the mother were eating the babies. That's how fish live. We would not wait for these small cows to grow up and be big before we took them. We would eat babies, just like we do with plants. We are eating the plant babies. Whenever we eat seeds or cereals or corn or apples or oranges or whatever, it's the babies. So the problem with fish is that they are animals, but they're breeding like plants, and they're eating like lions.
This is getting to be a very... I'm not saying that Jeppe is wrong, but we are fishing at least between 2,000 and 3,000 different species of fish, and we are farming around 700 species of fish. So there is a great diversity in this. And back in Norway, in the university in Bergen, I'm not sure that it would be appreciated if Jeppe would start telling the Norwegians to catch the cod when it is about this big. But they all go out and catch the capelin when it is about this big. Because these are two totally different species, with totally different natural histories, and you have to manage them differently. And it is quite likely that somewhere in Africa there are the wrong methods with regards to managing these fish. And I agree with him that the small fish is very important, and how we treat it is extremely important. That's one of the big projects that we've been running there, is to train people in drying fish in a more hygienic and sort of more food safety kind of a way. And by that you increase the value of it by tenfold. And there is a very interesting sort of social, even familial story that Shakuntala's boss told us at our Oceans conference in Washington last year, how do you split the big fish in the household compared to when you're cooking the small fish. So there is a lot going for the small fish, but it's not necessarily the general solution in every instant.
Okay, as in most other cases, when we talk about food security and nutrition, there's a lot more complexity underneath the statement we have time to make during 1 hour. We have 8 minutes left, and I would like to turn to the audience if there are any burning questions. I have lots of questions I could ask, but I would rather hear from the audience. I don't see anybody at the phone. If anybody wants to go to the microphone, now is a good time. In the meantime, Shakuntala, you were going to say something about sustainable intensification?
Yes, we've heard a lot since we started, and from many of the different presenters, about the demand for food and how do we meet the demand in 2030, 2050 with the population growing. And very quickly, the demand is equated with increased production and productivity. I would like us to think much more about using our investments and resources in reducing waste and losses, rather than jumping first to trying to increase production and productivity. And if we do that, that's going to help a long way into having sustainable food production.
How much are we losing? What percentage?
That's again a big problem because within fishery, within the fish sector, there's a dearth of data. But just the Chicago Council just put out a report and they said up to 1/3 of fish is lost.
Well, that's what we found in the HLP report on food losses and waste, about 1/3. Jeppe, is that your number?
I agree. It's about 40 million tons.
About 40 million tons. How many people would that feed? Well, let's not get there.
Well, then again, what do you feed? Do you want to feed quantity or do you want to feed nutritional quality? They are two very different parameters.
Exactly, absolutely. Go ahead.
Keith Fugly with the USDA. One of the concerns about the growth of aquaculture is that it hasn't really been a substitute for wild catch because of the need to feed the farmed fish with wild catched fish. So I was wondering if you could talk about the sustainability issue there.
Okay, feeding fish to fish. Jeppe.
That's correct. Initially, when we started aquaculture, we were feeding the salmon in Norway, at least, with fish meal from Peru and West Africa. There was a huge uproar around that. So now they are pushing this burden of feeding the fish on land from soy. And that's, of course, an economic choice. I mean, the fish can tolerate the soy. It's not as happy with soy as it is with wild fish, of course. You have to clean it. But we already have a lot of pressure on land. I mean, we're talking about feeding the world and 9 billion people, and now we are taking prime soy and giving it to a carnivore. It's like a farmer came to you and said, I want to breed lions, and I want to feed it meat and protein. I don't really see the point there. I mean, if we want to, I'm perfectly happy with aquaculture, but we can still feed them from the ocean. There's plenty of protein in the oceans that we are not utilizing. We don't have to push it on land.
Okay. Anybody else who would like to speak? Yes, go ahead.
That was actually a very nice transition to my questions, because we heard a lot about aquaculture. But if we decide to focus on Africa, which has the warmest coast that one can think of, yet the fishery industry is almost absent. And one question I have for the panel is that what can Africa actually learn from a country like Iceland, which has a well-developed culture and industry of fishing, to actually exploit those warmest coasts? Because I'm always puzzled when I travel across Africa. I see the European Union in West Africa, Senegal. I see Argentinian boats in the coast of Angola, the Chinese on the Mozambican side, yet the continent itself not really fully exploiting what it has, which could actually be a tremendous engine to boost the blue economies and address many challenges facing country within that continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very important question. We got 30 seconds to answer it. Who would like to answer it?
Yes, it's technology and governance, and primarily to make sure that you keep the resources in your own hands. Every successful fisheries country in the world, and that's including the USA and including Norway and Iceland, has kept the resources in their own hands.
Let me just, yes, see, you can't see this, but I can see that my time is up. So let me just end this wonderful panel discussion by with a plea. from now on, when we talk about how to deal with food insecurity and malnutrition, let's not forget fish. Let's incorporate fish into those discussions. And I'm making the same plea to the people who talk a lot about aquaculture, fisheries, and fish. Don't forget that there's life outside of the water. Let's see if we can integrate these things in both ends. Please join me in thanking the panel members for an excellent presentation.